Thank you. I hope you can all hear me all right.
Yep, fine.
Yeah. Okay, so John chapter 18, the first 27 verses. There's three events recorded for us in these verses. There's the arrest of Jesus in Gethsemane. There's his trial before Annas. And there's Peter's denial. And we hope to look at a bit of each of those three things. Starting with Gethsemane. Well, John's account of what happened in this Gethsemane is totally different from the other Gospels, isn't it? John goes straight to Judas coming with the soldiers to arrest Jesus. And he misses out what perhaps we would consider to be the most important event of what took place there, that of his praying for the cup to pass from him, and the fact that his disciples were sleeping and Jesus had to warn them to watch and pray. So why would John miss out what we think of as some very important details from what happened in the garden? Well, it's generally understood that the four Gospels portray Jesus, that the Gospel writers, their portrayal of Jesus, are likened to the four faces of the cherubim, you know, the lion, the ox, the man and the eagle. And John wants to show Jesus not as the servant, the ox, not as a mere man, not even as the king, the lion, but as the one who was spiritually above all others. The thoughts of Jesus and his actions, that they're far above all others, far above principalities and powers, and the one who's in total control. And so John, I think, misses out how Jesus showed his human side by praying for the cup to pass from him for that reason. And so John goes straight to the point where Judas arrives at the garden. And he tells us that this garden was a place where Jesus often resorted to. So it would be an easy place for Judas to find. He'd know Jesus would be there. I find it interesting. That's the only time we read about Jesus being in Gethsemane. And yet John tells us he went there often. And we wonder, when were those occasions? So then verse 3, Judas arrives with, I'm using the New King James Version, with what it says there, a detachment of troops. The word he arrives with these detachment of soldiers, plus officers from the high priest, plus some Pharisees. So there's quite a large group of people coming to arrest Jesus, isn't there? The word detachment means a cohort, and with the Roman soldiers, a cohort was usually 100 men. So as well as Roman soldiers, we also have some of the temple guard. So we've got both Jew and Gentile arrayed against Jesus. The other three Gospels describe it as a great multitude. Why did they come to Jesus with so many men? Why did they need so many? Well, they tried to take Jesus before, hadn't they? And it slipped through their fingers. That they'd sent a deputation on one occasion to arrest him as he taught in the temple. And they returned empty-handed, saying, "Never man spoke like this man." And once, while during his ministry, a crowd had tried to stone Jesus. And we're told it simply passed through the midst of them. So Jesus had this reputation of somehow managing to get away. But now they're taking no chances. They've got plenty of backup to help them out. And we wonder as well whether the reason they had so many was perhaps they were intending to arrest the disciples as well, not just Jesus, although we can't be sure about that. And then verse 4, John misses out the way in which Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss, which we're told about in the other Gospels. Instead, it's Jesus that takes the initiative, and he steps forward to ask, who are you looking for? And there's this comment by John that Jesus did this because he knew all things that would happen to him. Jesus knows he is to be crucified, and he's taken all the necessary actions to ensure that course is taken. I think there's an echo there of what we read in chapter 13 and verse 1, where we have the beginning of the account of the Last Supper, and Jesus washes the disciples' feet. But the reason he washes the disciples' feet, verse 1, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And the supper being ended, so on. It goes on to recount how he washes the disciples' feet. So Jesus is doing these things because he knows the end has come, and he knows what that end is, that he's going to be crucified. And he's managing things to ensure that Father's will is done. So Jesus says, well, here I am. But the party, instead of rushing forward to grab hold of Jesus, they draw back and they fall to the ground, it says in verse 6. Why? Why would they back off and fall to the ground? Well, there's been several suggestions put forward. Did they suspect an ambush? That Jesus was stepping forward to sort of take them off the guard, so that then the ambush would rush upon them. But then that's why they had the Roman soldiers with them, to prevent that very event happening. Did Jesus use the divine name when he said, I am? Well, there are other occasions in John's Gospel where Jesus said, I am, and it didn't provoke a reaction then with the people who were listening. And if he did use the divine name, and they understood it in that way, it would have been used against him in his trial. You know, they'd have said, look at what he said there. Another suggestion is that perhaps his face shone with the glory of God, having been with praying to God and the angels coming to him. And just as Moses' face shone when he came down from the mountain, so it did with Jesus. Well, if so, then it wouldn't have needed Judas to identify him, would it? He would have stood out in the darkness of the night. Another suggestion, which I'm perhaps inclined to go along with myself, were the guard expecting some form of judgment to be called down on them? See, the priests, they knew their scriptures, didn't they? And they knew the claim of Jesus to be the Messiah. So just imagine the crowd on the way from the high priest's palace to the garden, talking amongst themselves, and the temple guard, they'd perhaps ponder the implications of their mission, what they're going to do. Suppose Jesus really is the Messiah. What might happen when we try to arrest him? What do the scriptures say Messiah would do to his enemies? Psalm 27 verse 2 predicts that the enemies of Jesus of the Messiah would fall backwards. 2 Kings chapter 1, fire comes down to destroy the enemies of Elijah. And in the 2nd of Samuel 23, it predicts the enemies of Christ would be burned up with fire. So perhaps those from the temple, they were afraid that Jesus, if he's the Messiah, then he's going to call down fire on us. And if that's what they were worried about, the fact that Jesus didn't call down fire to destroy them might then have convinced them, well, Jesus can't be the Messiah, can he? But notice, though, how at this point, Jesus is the one that's in total command of the situation. They are responding to him rather than the other way around. And then at this point, each of the Gospels record for us that a disciple draws a sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Only John tells us that it was actually Peter who did it, and tells us that the servant was named Malchus. So we might want to consider why did Peter have a sword? Well, Luke in his Gospel in chapter 22, he tells us that the disciples actually had 2 swords between them. Why had they bothered to bring swords? Well, were they expecting trouble as they made their way up to Jerusalem to the Passover? They knew that this antagonism was building up between Jesus and the religious authorities, and so they thought, well, maybe we need to defend ourselves. Or it's possible that they were expecting Jesus when he got to Jerusalem. Now's the time to declare myself as king and rally the people round to fight the Romans. So they wanted to be ready if that happened. Just some thoughts as to why they might have had swords. Why does John mention Malchus by name? Was it because Malchus was moved by what happened to him to become a disciple and was therefore be known to John's readers? And why does John name Peter as the one who drew the sword when the other Gospels don't? Does John want to emphasize the contrast between the Peter in the garden and the Peter in the high priest's palace? Here, Peter is brave and ready to fight and possibly even to die to defend his Lord. And what a contrast to what happens next. So what does happen next? Well, Jesus is arrested and taken first of all to Annas. And John tells us that 2 disciples, follow at a distance. One of them is unnamed, and that one is known to the high priest, and so he could easily gain access to the courtyard of the house where the trial was taking place. And the other, of course, was Peter. And the first disciple arranges for Peter to be let into the courtyard as well. Now, it's generally argued that the first disciple was John, and perhaps John had supplied the house of Annas with fish, and that's why he is known to them. But here's another possibility. It's possible that it was actually Judas Iscariot, who was definitely known to the high priest because he'd been to see him to betray him. And when you think about it, Judas, having led the party to arrest Jesus, would be expected to go back with them and to maybe even had another role to play, that of being a witness in the trial of Jesus. So it makes more sense to me to think that it was actually Judas. And maybe Judas, having heard the prophecy of Jesus that Peter would deny him, that he even knew Jesus, that he'd think, well, if Peter's going to deny him, then maybe he would be willing to speak out as well against Jesus. And so he's therefore very happy to arrange for Peter to be let in. So Jesus faces 3 trials, in fact. There's the trial with Annas, held during the night, and the second trial with Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin during the following day, and then the trial before Pilate and Herod the day after that. John only mentions that second trial before the Sanhedrin very briefly in verse 24, without giving any details of what happened. And it was during these 2 religious trials before Annas and the Sanhedrin that Peter denies Jesus. It's not also easy to put things in the right sequence of events, comparing the four Gospels. And unfortunately, I sometimes find that brethren get the wrong end of the stick with some of the statements they make about these incidents. I have heard on several occasions brethren on the platform saying, well, Jesus was arrested in the night and crucified the next day. I hope to show you in a minute that couldn't be the case. Also, they've said that the trial before the Sanhedrin was illegal because it was held at night. And again, I don't think that was the case. Can I share my screen with you? And I want to show you a chart that I made quite a while ago now, trying to compare the four Gospels and what happened during the trials of Jesus and his crucifixion. So you've got the four Gospels laid up side by side, and the yellow there is Peter's first denial. This is before Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest at that time. And that was definitely held during the night. So that then there's a bit about Annas's interrogation of Jesus, which the other gospel writers don't give us, tell us. Interestingly, we're told in John's gospel how, we'll come to it in a bit, Jesus was smitten by one of the servants of the high priest. Luke goes a bit further, and he says there about how they just blindfolded him and struck him and asked him to prophesy, making more of it. Then it says Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And that's all he says about the next trial. But when was it? Well, Luke says, as soon as it was day. As soon as it was day. So daylight had come now. So this was 6 a.m. or afterwards that they go to the Sanhedrin. So this was the beginning of the trial before the Sanhedrin. So it was in daylight. When brethren say the trial was at night and was wrong, it definitely says in Luke that it was in the daytime. And it was during this second trial that we read that we have the other denials of Peter. The green is his second denial, and the red is his third denial. But notice what Luke says about the time between the second and third denial. About an hour had passed. So the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin lasted a minimum, an absolute minimum of 1 hour, and could have been a lot longer. But if we go to carry on down, we have a lot of detail about in the other three Gospels about that trial before the Sanhedrin, which John doesn't mention at all. But then you come to when morning came, early morning, they go on to Pilate. They pass Jesus on to Pilate for his trial before Pilate. So you've got an early morning there and an early morning up here. Is it the same early morning, or is it two separate early mornings? And if you go on to look at the trial before Pilate, it's midday when Pilate presents Jesus to the people and says, "Behold the man." And then the Gospel writers tell us it was early in the next morning when they led him away to be crucified. So we've got the possibility of 3 or 4 days in which Jesus was on trial before the various people. Okay, I'll stop my sharing there. I hope you could follow what we very quickly skimmed through there. But we're talking about the denial of Peter. And all four gospel writers tell us that as Peter was in the process of denying Jesus for the third time, that the cock crowed. What do we understand by this cock crowing? Well, it could be a literal cock crowing, couldn't it? But we're told that it's crowing for the second time. For the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. Have you ever, any of you ever experienced being on a farm or something where a cock crows? And when it starts to crow first thing in the morning, it doesn't just crow once and then go quiet. It keeps on crowing and crowing and crowing for quite a long while, with only just short gaps in between. But we're told there, we know from what we've just been looking at on that chart, it was more than an hour between the first and second crowing of the cock. Well, God could have caused the cock to stay silent for an hour, couldn't he? But it could mean that it's the start of the cock crowing on the second morning. So the first denial was while he was with Annas, and then the cock crew. Then Jesus was passed on to the Sanhedrin, and that lasted the whole day, and he's kept overnight. And it's early in the next morning that the cock crew the second time. Another suggestion is that it wasn't a literal animal crowing, but it's talking about the fourth watch of the night. The evening was divided into 4 watches, and the fourth watch of the night was sometimes described as the cock crowing because the cock crew during that watch. And the watch would be heralded by the blowing of a trumpet. So they described this blowing of the trumpet as the cock crowing to mark the changing of the guard. And somebody said, well, Jerusalem was such a big city that you blew the trumpet on one side, they wouldn't hear it on the other, so they had to blow it twice, and that's the 2 cock crowings. But would it take an hour to give the signal on both sides of the city? I wouldn't have thought so. So again, it could be the start of a new watch on the second successive morning. You see, what I'm trying to suggest is that the trial of Jesus he was captured in the night. He went all through the next day and into the day after before they took him to be Pilate. So the final denial was while Jesus was being interrogated. The first denial was while Jesus was being interrogated by Annas as day began to break. And the second and third denials were during the trial before the Sanhedrin. And that means that trial lasted all day and Jesus was kept a prisoner all night. And then Jesus was led to Pilate the following day. Why does John mention that the person who challenged Peter on the third occasion was a relative of Malchus? We wonder again, was she known to the readers? Perhaps she too was converted like Malchus was after seeing how Jesus healed him, having been had his ear cut off. There's a lesson, isn't there, with Peter's denial? He was so brave when they came to arrest Jesus. And when it's a big dramatic event, it can often be easier to stand up for the truth on those occasions. We can find it to be easy to preach the truth during a campaign, or if we're away on a trip with the Bible mission. But what about when it comes to talking to people at work or to our neighbours, just on a one-to-one basis? Is it so easy then to declare that we're followers of Christ? Do we sometimes fail to say who we are and what we stand for? I have to confess that there have been occasions when I've failed in that respect. And the fact that all four gospel writers record Peter's denials, it's surely an important lesson for us all. If someone like Peter, who is so close to his Lord, if he can fail, so can we. Unless we heed the advice of Jesus that he gave to the disciples in the garden: watch and pray, lest we enter into temptation. So Jesus is led away in the dead of night to Annas, and while he wasn't officially the high priest, he was certainly the power behind the throne. He has manipulated things so that each of his sons in turn, and now his son-in-law, would be the high priest. And he was definitely the one who was manipulating all the events. Now, it was actually forbidden under Jewish law, we're told, to hold a private pre-trial before going to the Sanhedrin. So what follows is unlawful. Then in verse 19, we read that Annas wants to know from Jesus about his disciples and about his doctrine. He wants to know about his disciples. Peter has just denied Jesus for the first time, and the cock had crowed once. And the inquiry from the servant girl at that point was probably just out of curiosity. But now, Peter would be wondering why Annas was asking about followers of Jesus. Does he want to arrest the disciples as well? So now, any question about the indeed of a disciple, it would be more than just a curious inquiry, wouldn't it? It could represent a definite threat. However, Annas was probably just trying to find out just how far the influence of Jesus had spread. Were any of the Sanhedrin, for example, his followers? He asked about his teaching. Well, surely Annas knew all about his teaching. He'd sent men to arrest Jesus, and he'd sent others to try and trick Jesus into saying something wrong. And his spies would have kept Annas informed as to what Jesus was doing and saying. So that the method Annas was using was totally wrong. He was questioning Jesus to try and get him to condemn himself. What he should have done was to put the charges before Jesus, together with any witnesses, and then expected Jesus to answer. And when Jesus answers in verse 20 and 21 and tells Annas to ask those who heard me teaching in the temple what he taught, he may well have been pointing at some of the crowd around who had been amongst those who had arrested him and the temple guard. And some of them would have been the ones who had been sent to spy on Jesus. You can imagine him pointing, that's them. They'll tell you what I've taught. Then one of the temple guards strikes Jesus across the face in rebuke for what he saw as insolence of Jesus. Now the word struck, used by John, means to deliver. But when Jesus asks, why do you strike me? He uses a different word, a much stronger word, a word that means to flog or to scourge. And that's why I pointed out when we were looking at that comparison, how Luke mentions about him being blindfolded and beaten and that. It was more than just a quick slap across the face. It was a definite beating up. So it was much more than just that, we said. Now the officer was quoting from Exodus 22:28 when he struck Jesus. But in response, Jesus quotes from Exodus 23, the first three verses, where it says, You shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. Right? Do not put a hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. He definitely put a hand to Jesus, hadn't he? So when daybreak came, as Luke tells us, Jesus was led to Caiaphas, where the Sanhedrin had gathered. It was probably not the whole Sanhedrin, but a select few who had been summoned during the night. It didn't need a full 70 to form a quorum. Now, John doesn't mention this trial at all, for each of the other Gospels gives us much more of the detail. And it's during this trial, as we've said, that Peter again denies Jesus and the cock crows the second time. And as we've seen, the trial went on for at least an hour, because there was that length of time between the second and third temptations of Jesus. So John, in his record of the trial, he's concentrating on Jesus before the leader of the Jewish religion with Annas, the head one. And he's showing how in his attitude and in his demeanour, Jesus was the superior one. This head-to-head between the two, Jesus was the one who was able to counter anything that was thrown at him. And next, he's going to be led away to Pilate, where he's going to show his superiority over the secular Gentile leaders of Pilate and Herod. But that's the subject of the next talk, isn't it? Thank you.